Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, I want to talk about a truth most people never see, not because it's hidden, but because avoidants are masters of pretending it doesn't exist. I want to talk about why avoidants collapse after pushing empaths into silence. Why the very moment they believe they've finally won the emotional battle is the exact moment their internal world begins to fall apart. Avoidants and empaths are magnetic opposites. One feels everything, the other suppresses everything. One reaches out to connect, the other retreats to protect. And in the beginning, this dynamic feels like balance, but over time, it becomes a battlefield. The empath gives, understands, softens, and tries to love the avoidant past their fear. The avoidant takes, withdraws, resists, and hides behind emotional distance. The avoidance collapse begins the moment the empath stops giving emotional energy, because everything the avoidant thought they controlled depended on a dynamic they never understood. Avoidants don't run relationships, they run from emotions. And the only reason they could run without facing destruction was because the empath was always there, softening the impact. The empath's heart, patience, warmth, and emotional labor acted like cushions that protected the avoidant from feeling the consequences of their own avoidance. As long as the empath kept giving, the avoidant never had to deal with the emptiness inside them. They never had to confront their emotional gaps, their fears, their past wounds, or the parts of themselves they had buried under detachment. For an avoidant, the empath's emotional energy is like oxygen. They would never admit it, but it regulated them. It helped them feel wanted without being vulnerable. It gave them validation without effort. It made them feel emotionally significant without having to reciprocate. The empath didn't just love them. The empath made them feel safe through absolute understanding, forgiveness, and unconditional presence. And at the time, the avoidant mistook all of that for something ordinary. They thought the empath would always be there. They thought that connection was guaranteed. They thought they had all the time in the world to keep running while the empath kept reaching. But then comes the moment that changes everything. The moment the empath goes silent, not cold, not dramatic, not punishing, just quiet. A silence born from exhaustion, not anger. A silence that says, I can't carry both of our hearts anymore. And at first, the avoidant doesn't notice. They think it's a break, a reset, a temporary phase. They assume the empath will return, as they always have. They assume the emotional energy will flow back like it always did. But slowly, with every hour of quiet that passes, the avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar, instability. The foundation they relied on begins to shake. Their internal system, which was regulated by the empath's presence, begins to malfunction. That's when the collapse begins, not externally, but internally. Avoidants have spent their whole lives believing their power lies in distance. They feel strong when they withdraw. They feel safe when they suppress. They feel in control when they stay emotionally unavailable. But when the empath goes silent, that safety becomes isolation. That distance turns into emptiness. Their emotional detachment, which once protected them, now becomes the very thing that destabilizes them. Because for the first time, the avoidant has no emotional source to rely on. The empath's love is no longer cushioning their fear. The empath's patience is no longer absorbing their coldness. The empath's effort is no longer filling the gaps in connection they refuse to acknowledge. Now the avoidant has to sit with everything they always avoided. Their self-worth, their insecurities, their old wounds, their emotional hunger, their fear of intimacy, their fear of abandonment. Everything they suppressed in the name of independence rises to the surface, and there is no empath to soothe it. Their emotional armor begins to crack under the weight of their own unprocessed feelings, and that collapse doesn't come loudly, it comes quietly. In the silence, they start to feel the absence of the empath's presence. They feel the loss of emotional warmth they once dismissed as too much. They feel the longing for connection they convinced themselves they didn't need. They feel the heaviness of regret because the silence forces them to confront the truth. They thought the empath's love was endless, but it wasn't. They thought they had all the power, but they never did. They thought they could distance themselves without consequence, but now they see the cost. Avoidants collapse because they finally have to face themselves without the empath's emotional safety net. They collapse because the silence they used as a weapon becomes a mirror they cannot run from. They collapse because they realize that the empath's energy wasn't a burden. It was the only thing keeping the relationship alive. And now, without it, They feel the emotional gravity of what they pushed away. Their collapse is not about losing the empath, it's about losing the emotional structure the empath was holding together alone. It's about losing the feeling of being important, wanted, grounded, and emotionally connected without having to work for it. The moment the empath goes silent, the avoidant's internal foundation begins to collapse because, for the first time, they are forced to feel everything they spent their whole life trying not to feel. Avoidants confuse silence with strength until the empath finally becomes silent too. To an avoidant, silence has always been a shield. It's how they protect themselves, how they regulate overwhelm, how they regain control when emotional closeness feels too intense. They retreat into quiet the way most people retreat into comfort. Silence, for them, is not punishment, it's survival. They use it to calm their nervous system, to distance themselves from feelings they don't understand, and to avoid the vulnerability that intimacy requires. In their world, silence equals power. It means they are in control of their emotions, their environment, and the pace of the relationship. As long as they can retreat into silence, they can avoid the discomfort of love's demands. And for a long time, it works, because the empath fills the space their silence creates. The empath reaches out, reassures, softens, and bridges the emotional gap. Every time the avoidant pulls away, the empath moves closer. Every time the avoidant goes quiet, the empath speaks love into the void. And because the empath responds with connection rather than withdrawal, the avoidant believes their silence is strength. They believe it protects them without consequence. They assume the relationship will always survive because the empath will always do the emotional labor they avoid. But then something happens that the avoidant never anticipates. The empath finally becomes silent too. Not because they've lost interest, and not because they want to hurt the avoidant, but because they've reached their emotional saturation point. Empaths don't go silent easily. They go silent when their soul is tired of speaking into walls. They go silent when they realize their voice is no longer heard. They go silent when loving someone begins to feel like bleeding instead of growing. The moment the empath becomes silent, the avoidant's entire perception of strength shatters. Silence no longer feels safe, it feels threatening. It no longer feels like control, it feels like loss. The stillness that once comforted them now presses on their chest like weight they can't lift. They feel something they've suppressed for years, emotional panic. Because the empath's silence is not empty, it is filled with meaning, boundaries, and truth. It says, I won't chase you anymore. It says, I've given all I can. It says, this time, the distance is mine, not yours. And that is the moment the avoidant realizes that their silence was never strength, it was dependency, disguised as control. They depended on the empath's willingness to keep trying. They depended on their forgiving nature. They depended on their emotional resilience. Now that the empath is silent, the avoidant has no buffer, no emotional cushion, no one to regulate the connection for them. Their silence turns into a mirror, reflecting their own emotional emptiness. Avoidants collapse because the empath's silence reveals a truth they've been running from their entire life. They never mastered emotional distance. They depended on the other person to close the gap. Without the empath filling the silence with warmth, affection, reassurance, and love, the avoidant is left with the rawness of their own emptiness. They begin to feel the very things they tried to outrun: loneliness, insecurity, longing, and regret. The silence becomes louder than the arguments they avoided, louder than the emotions they suppressed, louder than the distance they created. It's loud because, for the first time, they're not the ones who chose it. They can control their own withdrawal, but they cannot control the empath's. And that lack of control triggers the deepest wound of all, the fear of losing someone who mattered more than they admitted. Avoidants spent years thinking silence made them strong, but the empath's silence reveals the truth. Real strength was in the person who kept speaking, giving, loving, and trying. Real strength was in vulnerability, not withdrawal. When the empath stops reaching out, the avoidant is forced to confront something they never wanted to face. Their silence did not protect the relationship, it dismantled it. And now, that same silence they once used as armor becomes the very thing that pierces through it. Because when the empath finally goes silent, the avoidant realizes their idea of strength was never strength at all. It was fear, wearing the mask of control. And the collapse happens when they see, perhaps for the first time, that silence is not power. Silence is loss. And this time, it's their loss. The empath's silence forces the avoidant to face the one thing they've always run from themselves. Avoidants build their entire emotional identity around distancing from discomfort. They survive by suppressing, numbing, withdrawing, and disconnecting from anything that feels too vulnerable or too intimate. Their coping strategy isn't random. It was crafted in childhood, reinforced by wounds they never healed. And as adults, they continue to run from the very parts of themselves that feel unsafe, unfamiliar, or overwhelming. As long as the empath keeps speaking, comforting, forgiving, and trying, the avoidant never has to turn inward. They never have to confront the fears they hide behind detachment. They can project, blame, rationalize, and avoid accountability because the empath's emotional effort keeps everything functioning. But when the empath becomes silent, suddenly there is nothing left to hide behind. The avoidant is no longer shielded by the empath's explanations, reassurances, or emotional labor. All the noise they used to drown themselves in is gone. No one is soothing them. No one is chasing. No one is absorbing the emotional impact of their distance. And the moment that emotional mirror breaks, the avoidant is forced into an emotional confrontation they never prepared for. A confrontation with their own fears, wounds, insecurities, and patterns. Avoidants fear their inner world more than they fear losing the relationship. That's why they run. That's why they withdraw. That's why they shut down when feelings get too intense. Facing themselves means facing the parts of them that were never loved properly, never nurtured, never validated. It means confronting the belief that they are unworthy of closeness, that vulnerability is dangerous, that intimacy equals abandonment. As long as the empath was present, overflowing with patience, love, and emotional warmth, the avoidant didn't have to face those beliefs. They could hide behind the empath's strength. But the silence exposes everything. It shines a spotlight on the void inside them. It reveals how empty their emotional avoidance really is. In the silence, they start to feel things they've suppressed for years: fear, loneliness, regret, longing, abandonment, confusion. These emotions hit them all at once because they never learned how to process them slowly, safely, or honestly. They relied on the empath to regulate the connection, to keep love alive, to hold the emotional balance steady. Now, with that regulation gone, the avoidant is left drowning in their own internal chaos. The silence becomes a mirror. It reflects back to them the coldness they gave. It reflects the distance they created. It reflects the pain they caused. And most of all, it reflects the truth. They pushed away the one person who saw them deeply, accepted them fully, and loved them genuinely. That awareness is devastating because avoidants do not know how to forgive themselves easily. They may not show emotion like an empath does, but they feel it just in a delayed, overwhelming, internal way. When the empath goes silent, the avoidant's coping strategies stop working. Ignoring doesn't bring relief. Distracting doesn't numb the ache. Rationalizing doesn't make sense anymore. They can't blame the empath for being too emotional because there is no emotion left coming from them. They can't say they needed space because the space is now suffocating. They can't claim they prefer independence because this independence feels like abandonment. The avoidant now faces the truth that they weren't running from the empath, they were running from their own emotional vulnerability. And in the silence, that vulnerability finally catches up with them. It exposes the emotional immaturity they've hidden behind their strong facade. It shows them the consequences of choosing fear over connection. It reveals how deeply they actually cared and how their avoidance sabotaged the very thing they wanted but didn't know how to receive. Facing themselves is the collapse. It's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, internal, and relentless. The empath's silence leaves them alone with their thoughts, their regrets, their inadequacies, and their unmet needs. And for someone who has built their identity on avoiding emotional truth, this internal confrontation feels like an emotional earthquake. They realize the empath's love was the emotional anchor that kept them stable without them ever acknowledging it. Now that anchor is gone, and the avoidant is left drifting, forced to face the truths they never wanted to see. That is why the empath's silence becomes the catalyst for the avoidant's collapse. Because silence doesn't just remove the empath's voice, it removes the avoidant's excuses. And once they lose those excuses, they must finally face the one thing they've avoided their entire life: themselves. The avoidant expected pursuit, not peace, and that unexpected peace breaks their ego. Avoidants live in a psychological world where they assume emotional imbalance will always tilt in their favor. They're used to being chased, reassured, forgiven, and accommodated. They count on the empath's predictable response, the reaching out after withdrawal, the attempts to fix things, the emotional explanations, the softness that makes everything feel safe again. They don't consciously see it as manipulation. It's simply the emotional pattern they've known all their lives. They retreat, and someone else closes the distance. They pull back, and someone else leans forward. This cycle gives them a sense of power, not because they enjoy hurting someone, but because being pursued makes them feel wanted without requiring vulnerability. So when the avoidant pulls away, they fully expect the empath to come closer. Their ego expects the same dynamic to repeat. The empath crying, explaining, comforting, apologizing for wanting too much, begging for clarity, or simply trying to keep the connection alive. In their mind, this is how relationships work. They withdraw, you try harder, and the power dynamic resets. It's what makes them feel safe. It's what makes them feel in control. It's what makes them believe they can keep love without having to show up fully for it. But then, something happens that the avoidant never prepared for. The empath stops pursuing. The empath doesn't plead, doesn't over-explain, doesn't try to fix the silence. Instead, they simply get quiet, peacefully quiet, calmly quiet. A silence that holds no desperation, no pain, no emotional tugging. A silence that doesn't chase or question. A silence that doesn't revolve around the avoidant's emotional comfort. A silence that says, "I've accepted the truth you cannot speak." This peace terrifies the avoidant more than any argument ever could. Arguments mean connection still exists. Tears mean the empath still cares. Questions mean the empath still wants understanding. Pursuit means the avoidant still has emotional value. But peace, true, calm, detached. Peace is the one thing their ego was not built to handle. Because peace means the empath is no longer fighting for the connection. Peace means the empath has stopped trying to revive what the avoidant kept killing with distance. Peace means they are no longer emotionally dependent on the avoidant's presence. Peace means the empath doesn't need them anymore. Avoidants collapse under this peace because it threatens the very foundation of their emotional identity. Their sense of worth has quietly depended on someone wanting them more than they were willing to give. As long as someone pursued them, they didn't have to face their fear of abandonment or intimacy. They could pretend they were independent, self-contained, unaffected. But when the empath steps back, the avoidant is suddenly forced to experience what it feels like when love stops knocking. They feel the void where attention used to be. They feel the emptiness where validation once lived. They feel the quiet where emotional safety once came from the empath's efforts. The avoidant's ego begins to crack in that quiet, because now they're confronted with a truth they've ignored all their life. You cannot expect someone to keep fighting for you while you keep running from them. They realize they didn't just lose pursuit, they lost importance. They lost emotional significance. They lost the role they played in the empath's life. And that loss forces them to confront an insecurity they have buried under years of avoidance. The fear that if they don't keep someone chasing them, they will not be chosen at all. This peace is not passive, it's powerful. It reveals the avoidant's emotional dependence on the chase they pretended not to care about. It exposes how much they relied on the empath to give the relationship meaning, movement, and depth. It shows them that their silence was never strength. It was privilege granted by someone who loved them enough to fill the emotional gaps. And now, with the empath silent, the avoidant realizes that their emotional power was never real. It was borrowed from the empath's effort. The ego collapses because peace leaves no place to hide. No emotional noise, no conflict to blame, no chase to rely on. Peace is the moment the avoidant realizes they're alone, not because the empath stopped loving, but because the avoidant never learned how to stay. And once that truth sets in, the collapse begins. Avoidants collapse because silence reveals what their fear cost them, the one person who loved them without conditions. Avoidants spend their lives believing that distance keeps them safe. They pull away when things get too real, too emotional, too vulnerable. They tell themselves they're protecting their peace, guarding their independence, preserving their identity. But what they never realize until it's too late is that the very distance they use as a shield eventually becomes the weapon that destroys the one connection that was actually safe for them. When the empath finally goes silent, the avoidant is forced to confront the truth. The silence is not a punishment, it's a consequence. And that consequence reveals everything they lost, everything they pushed away, everything fear cost them. Avoidance